Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today is Sabbath, January 16th, 2021, and I want to welcome you all to the first full study of 2021. And for my topic today, I chose something that it's actually quite a broad topic, but I wanted to just start examining it a little bit more closely. It's something that I haven't really looked at in a very in a deeper way, as deeply as I'd like to look at it today, and probably next week as well. I may make an exception to the Bible Hour 1 next week and actually do this in two parts, because as I began to look at different verses and different things that I wanted to get across, it became evident to me pretty quickly that there's no way in just one study today that I can cover some of the verses and things that I wanted to cover. So please be prepared for a second part to this next week, and it will do another full-blown study next week, and then we'll get back to the Bible Hour 1 after that. But I think it's an important topic, and it's one that I've actually wanted to touch upon in a while, but I shied away from it for various reasons. And the topic specifically, I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll give you some more of my thoughts on it. The topic is women in the Bible, a closer look. Women in the Bible, a closer look. Let me just say a few things that will happen in this study and a few things that will not happen. So let me start with what will not happen. There's no way in one or even two short studies that I can do justice to a topic like this. When we're talking about literally half the gender, right, of the world, okay, and I'm not even going to get into issues of gender politics and some of the issues that we're dealing with regard to the way secular society is viewing gender these days. That I would like to cover, but another day. That just can't introduce another element here. But when you're talking about half the gender of the planet, you don't take that lightly, right? And you don't even presume to be able to cover all of that in just a couple of short studies. So what I'm going to be doing, what I'm not going to be doing is giving complete clarity on the topic of women in the Bible, right? And I'm not going to, at least today, I'm not going to go into some of the more controversial verses, for lack of a better term, at least not deeply. I may touch upon them to an extent, but I will reserve those for part 2, where I can go into a little bit more deeper explanation of possible interpretations out there. So just ask you to be patient, because there are traditional viewpoints on many of the verses that we're going to be examining, and the way that I view those verses based on study in recent months and years, I have a bit of a different viewpoint on some of those verses than you may traditionally be familiar with. Another thing we will not do is we're not going to enter into controversy, right? It's too easy when it comes to topics like this to start, digging heels into positions and agendas, and I'm not about that. So we're not going to enter into controversy about things. We can always have questions and we can have interpretations, but we're not going to have arguments. So that's one thing that I want to make very clear. Now, what will we do? Well, we're going to take a broad view of the topic of women in the Bible, and I want to read some things to you from a commentary or two that I think will help us to better understand this topic and give us a clearer understanding of scriptures. And the reason I'm going to turn to commentaries today is because sometimes things are written so well that they can explain things in a much better way than I can by trying to summarize those things to you. So I want to read directly from one particular commentary today, which is the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society Torah commentary. And we'll be able to get some insights from that I think will help us to better understand the topic at hand. Okay, do you need a minute for me to? Okay, cool. All right, so that being said, let me start by reading, and by the way, for New Testament, I'm going to be reading from N.T. Wright's The Kingdom New Testament. And for Old Testament today, I'm going to do a more conservative version, which is called the New Revised Standard Version. New Revised Standard Version. Okay. So let's start by going to Galatians 3, verse 28. Galatians 3, verse 28. I want to start here, and I think it'll become evident pretty quickly why. So this is what Paul is saying to the Galatian assembly. Galatia was one of the principal assemblies that was established, and it was in a place called Asia Minor, which corresponds today to what you would consider Western Turkey. And Galatia was one of the main provinces of the time, and there was a very prominent assembly. A lot of people think, by the way, that that Galatia, that the letter to the Galatians, excuse me, this is a letter that Paul wrote to the Galatians. A lot of people think that that may have been the first of the New Testament writings for a number of reasons, but that's neither here nor there for today. So Galatians 3, verse 27. Says, "You see, every one of you who has been baptized into the Messiah has put on the Messiah. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no male and female. You are all one in the Messiah Yahshua. And if you belong to the Messiah, you are Abraham's family. You stand to inherit the promise." There's no longer, verse 28, there's no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There is no male and female. One of the things that Paul, the apostle, was trying to do as a result of his ministry was to dispel any notions that there were any differences of any significant sort between peoples of different ethnicities, right? And we're going to talk more about that for anyone who participates in the sessions that we're going to have about race, right? If you haven't seen that, I'll talk more about that later after the study today. But also with regard to issues of gender, male and female, and also issues of caste or class, slave or free, which are the two main classes that existed, economic classes and social classes of Paul's day. And Paul was trying to essentially show that in Messiah Yahshua, anyone who becomes part of this movement that is contingent upon Yahshua as the king, anyone who is in him, anyone who believes in him, anyone who believes in his message and who takes his message to heart, is for all intents and purposes equal in the eyes of Yahweh with regard to the message of salvation. Does it mean that there are no differences or distinctions between, one group and another, or between one gender or another? No, of course, you're always going to have distinctions between people, right? And that includes distinctions on issues of gender, right? But what Paul is saying here in Galatians 3:28 is that he's dispelling the notion that with regard to the message of salvation, that there's any distinction between any people, but we're all one and we're all equal in the eyes of Yahweh in terms of the message of salvation. So I wanted to start with that verse because it's important to understand this equality aspect between men and women. And that is not unique just to Paul's message with regard to salvation, but that goes all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to Genesis. And the same thing could be said about nations, right? Nations, there's no one people that's superior to another. That's how these issues of race have become problematic in society. And of course, these are all ways in which the adversary has used to drive wedges between people, between individuals, and between nations, to cause the kind of problems that are now being righted by the message of salvation and by, in other words, by this gospel message that we're bringing out to the world. So when you look at the issues that we have with regard to racial issues and social issues and economic issues and problems of class and the way some people make themselves superior over others, et cetera. And when you look at gender issues and the gender politics that occur, I don't want to be simplistic about any of that, but generally speaking, these are strategies of the adversary to divide and conquer, right? So it is our job as proclaimers of the gospel, as proclaimers of the good news, to do our best to dispel these notions that put wedges between people, because we're part of that program to set the world right. And our King is the one that's leading us in that charge. So in the beginning, these things were not so. It was a course of time in which Satan drove a wedge, starting around Genesis 3, where he drove a wedge between male and female, and then things kind of took a downhill turn from there. So let's go back to Genesis 1, okay? Because Genesis 1 is going to help us to sort of set the foundation for the things that we're going to study. So if you go to Genesis 1, beginning with verse 27, that's a good place to begin. So we're talking about creation here, right? And we're on the 6th day of creation, and Yahweh is starting to do the final touches on creation. And he leaves one very important element in this creation out until the 6th day. And this is what he does on the 6th day, beginning with verse 26. Then Elohim said, "Let us make humankind in our image." And a lot of versions will say, "Let us make man in our image." But the word Adam, as we'll see, refers to humankind. And that's an important distinction. Then Elohim said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So Elohim created humankind in his image. In the image of Elohim, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Elohim blessed them, and Elohim said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Okay, and then he goes on and he explains a few other things. So the first thing I want you to notice there is Elohim makes a decision to create humankind. He says, "Let us make humankind in our image." What is this us? What is this our? Well, there are all kinds of interpretations there, but the only one that makes sense biblically is that this is Elohim, which is a plural word in and of itself, which consists of, and we'll do a study about that another day, which consists of Father and Son, right? Yahshua in his pre-existent form, Yahweh the Father is speaking to him, and he's saying, "Let us make man in our image," right? He can't be talking about the angels, because the angels are not created in the image of Elohim. There's no indication of that in the scriptures. He's talking about himself, he's talking about his son, and he's talking about mankind, humankind, as being made in the image of Elohim, okay? So what's happening here? As I've explained a number of times in the past several weeks, the first chapter of Genesis is what's being described as the creation. And scholars are increasingly recognizing that the pattern that's being described here is that of a temple being built. And there are 7 stages of this temple being built. And when you create a temple, the purpose of a temple is to reflect the glory of the personage whose temple it is to others. And that is the purpose with Yahweh's temple. So Yahweh's temple is going to reflect his image, his glory to all of humanity. So what is the last thing that you put when you create a temple? The last thing that you put in there is an image. Now, we tend to think of an image as, just in terms of wood and stone and these idols, right? But that's not the image, obviously, that we're talking about here, because there is no image per se in Yahweh's temple, right? When you looked at the tabernacle and when you look at the temple later, the larger structure of the temple, there was no image in there. It was in the innermost, the innermost sanctuary, which is known as the Holy of Holies. There was the Ark of the Covenant, which the cover of which was called the mercy seat. It represented the throne of Almighty Yahweh, and his presence would fill it. And of course, his presence could not be seen. There was a manifestation of smoke, and the incense, for example, on Yom Kippur would mingle with that smoke. But Yahweh's not the smoke, of course. It's just a representation of what his glory would be like, filling the entire structure. Okay, but there is no image there. But it's an interesting thing that the reason that there's no image in there is because the only one who would represent his image would be one like him in personality, in character, etc. And that person would be man. So the last image, spiritually speaking, right? It's not a physical image per se. It's more of a metaphorical representation of Yahweh. The last thing that's put in this temple that's built at creation is humankind, is man. And I keep emphasizing humankind because humankind consists of male and female. Okay, Yahshua had to come as a man. He had to come as a physical representation of a man because man was the last one put into that as part of creation, and he was representative of Yahweh in his image. He was gonna because man had fallen in he had fallen from the vision that Almighty Yahweh had with humankind being his vice regent. What does that mean? Meaning that man would represent him in creation. He would represent him as the one holding dominion over the birds of the sea, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. In other words, that intimate connection that exists between Yahweh and man is very, very special. So man was meant to reflect Yahweh's image, to reflect to be almost like a mirror of Yahweh throughout the earth. And everything that he did in subduing the earth and ruling over the earth was meant to be as if Yahweh was doing it himself, ruling over the earth, a vice regent with Almighty Yahweh. And when man he failed in that responsibility, then Yahweh put a plan into action to restore his glory in the earth, because man had not adequately reflected that because he had fallen into sin. So he eventually sent, so that's the first Adam, man, right, representative, and he eventually sent the second Adam, Yahshua. This is what you see in 1 Corinthians. He sent Yahshua to be the perfect man, to be the perfect representation of Yahweh. It's very interesting that even among the Gentiles, this plan was recognized. If you recall, I think it's in John, I have to double check, when Yahshua comes before Pontius Pilate looks at him. Do you remember what he said to him? He said, Ecce homo, behold the man. It's a recognition of something special. And he didn't even know what he was saying, what was coming out of his mouth. So I'm saying all this because I want you to understand the special nature of man, and more accurately of humankind, right? Because I mean man in a generic sense. So it says, Elohim created humankind in his image to reflect his glory. In the image of Elohim, he created them, male and female, he created them. What is that? That's equality. That's equal. Why did he create a woman? Well, he created a woman because man was not complete. The male was not complete, more accurately. So if you go over to chapter 2, and we begin reading down in verse 18, then Yahweh Elohim said, it is not good that the man should be alone. Now, speaking of the male, right? It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. So out of the ground, Yahweh Elohim formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man and see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So that's man's authority over the creation. The man gave names to all cattle, to the birds of the air, and to every animal of the field. But for the man, there was not found a helper as his partner. Notice the term partner. So Yahweh Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up its flesh with flesh. So what is that representing? That's representing an extremely intimate closeness that he would not have with any other of the creation. And it says, verse 22, and the rib that Yahweh Elohim had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So Adam, he sees this woman, he calls her Isha. And he says, I call her woman, for out of man, this one was taken. The word in Hebrew for man, in this case, is ish. Ish, Isha. They're one and the same. Okay? And there's much more I'm going to say about that in a couple of minutes. But I want to say in Genesis 2, verse 18, it says, I will make him a helper as his partner. He created the male and female. And the implication is that they correspond to one another. They're like two halves that need to be together in order to be complete. And I'm not just talking semantics here. I'm not just talking philosophy. And I'm not talking to be, condescending or to be, or to somehow, to somehow, to like satisfy, the female of the species, right? I'm not trying to be cutesy about things. This is scripture, right? And I'm getting very deeply philosophical here not because I want to be philosophical, because this all translates to practicality, but because our world has such a messed up view of gender that I want to dispel from your mind the cultural aspects that have polluted male and female relations in our world. Our foundation is this text, is the scriptures. So our paradigm for male and femaleness, our paradigm for relationships, our paradigm for race relations, our paradigm for all these things that have become divisive in our world for centuries, our paradigm has to be based on what Yahweh says, not on what this world says, not what the secular culture says, not what the psychologists say, not what Dr. Phil says, what Oprah says, or whoever else is out there these days. I don't even know who they are. They don't determine that. Yahweh's word is what determines that. And that's why we're going back to roots today, right? So if you want to understand male and female relations, if you want to understand the proper role of men and the proper role of women in the scriptures, in the world, this is where you're going to get it from, because this is our standard of faith and practice. Okay. So let's continue. Genesis 2, verse 18. Then Yahweh Elohim said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. So the primary reason for male and female being together, right, is correspondence to one another. And closely related to that is intimacy, right? I have said so many times in my preaching, in my studies, that men, that humankind, men and women are relational creatures. Humankind is relational. That's how Yahweh made us, purposefully. And this is the foundation of that right here, Genesis 2:18. We're meant to have intimacy with one another. That's why things like this pandemic are trying to the soul, because people are trying to do something very unnatural, which is get on without having other human beings. This is why community is placed on such a high level, and a premium is placed on community in the scriptures. This is why one of the greatest calamities that can befall a human being is to be cut off from community. So there's an actual punishment when you look at a judgment and a resulting punishment that you look at in the Torah, which is known as karat, which means to cut off. We tend to refer to it in using terms like banishment or exile or excommunication in a religious context. Excommunication, especially in the ancient world, was a fate worse than death, because you're dead, you don't feel anything anymore. But what's it like to be a living person without another soul to care for them or to care for? That is painful. That's a fate worse than death. So to be karat, to be cut off, was no empty threat, right? Because of this, because we're intimately related to one another, and no one on this earth can do it alone. And that's celebrated in our art, in our music, in our TV shows, in our movies, right? Anyone remember the series Lost on TV? Went on for 6 seasons. Who knows how many episodes that is? Over 100 episodes. Okay. If anyone ever saw that series Lost, what was the main theme of Lost? And that's a secular show. That's not a religious show. Well, not exactly anyway, right? But the theme of Lost was that none of us can make it alone. None of us does it alone. And that you could probably trace that to half a dozen movies, and right, and just naming them off the top of your head. You know, these things come out in the popular culture because they're so deeply ingrained within us. We don't do it alone. So Genesis 2:18, there's something else that's going on here that's incredibly important to realize with regard to women in particular. So it says that the woman is made, I will make him, it's not good that man should be alone. So that's the fundamental reason why man could not stay alone, because it's not good. Everything that Yahweh had made said it is good. This is good. The evening and the first day, Yahweh saw that it was good. And Yahweh did this, and Yahweh saw that it was good, right? Then he does something. He creates this man, but it says, right? So in Genesis 1:27, it says he created the male and female, is just giving you kind of the broad overview. And then he starts going and giving you the details in chapter 2. And this is how it happened. This is how he created the male and female. So he creates the male, and the male is alone. He has the animals, right? So he's not technically alone, but he has no one that's like him. He has no one that has his mind, that has his intellect, that has his way of being. And by the way, notice every animal was created after their own kind, the beasts after their kind, the birds after their kind, etc. Only man was different. Only man was created in the image of Elohim, right? So of course he wasn't going to correspond to any of the animals. So none of the animals could become his partner. He could love them. He can have great care over them, but none of them would ever love him or have that kind of intimacy, but the woman would, right? So Yahweh says, I will make him a helper as his partner. And the Hebrew term here is interesting. The Hebrew term is Ezer Kenegdo, Ezer Kenegdo. And the Ezer Kenegdo concept is interesting. The word Ezer it means helper. So the word Kenegdo implies like a fitting helper. Ezer Kenegdo means a fitting helper. Some versions say a helper suitable for him. What it implies, what it literally means, is a helper corresponding to him. It's like if you take two halves, right? And it's interesting how foreign ideas, ideas that is foreign to the scriptures, they emulate these things because there's always an element of truth in things, right? So if you ever seen, for example, the concept of the yin and the yang, right? What is that? That's this. That's one thing that corresponds to the other, right? So and the two things make a whole, they make a completion. So whenever we talk about in the popular culture, right, this foolishness about man dominating over women, or women trying to dominate men, they're both wrong. It's all foolishness, because in the eyes of Yahweh, they're equals. This says so. They correspond to one another. Now, in terms of their inherent nature. Now, in terms of Yahweh's created order, there is a difference. And I'm not going to apologize for that. The scriptures describes a created order for many, many things, for many, many systems. And in the system that Yahweh has described, particularly with regard to the family, he designates in different ways, he designates the male of that relationship as having the designated hierarchical leadership within that arrangement. But that is not an inherent superiority. That doesn't exist. That superiority doesn't exist. This says so. Men and women are equal. I can't say it any plainer than that. Okay? They are incomplete, the one without the other. So the woman was created to be a helper corresponding to him. So with that in mind, for the first 2 chapters of Genesis, I want to turn now to the Jewish Publication Society commentary. And I'm going to read several passages from here to give you insights. Because like I said, I can't explain it better than this. I'm not even going to try. This JPS Torah commentary, Jewish Publication Society, it's been around forever. And the gentleman who wrote this particular one, sadly, he's gone now. He's been gone for many years. His name was Nahum Sarna. And Nahum Sarna was a widely respected scholar. And I'm just going to pick some random passages here. And I want you to really pay close together. Yes, order, organization. That's right. Because Yahweh's an Elohim of order, right? We'll talk more about that order a little bit later. But like I said, we'll have a part 2, Yahweh willing, next week. And I'll talk even more about that as we get into some of the verses about leadership and the role of women in public worship and things of that nature, okay? And again, we're not going to resolve all that even next week, okay? I promise you that centuries of relations between men and women in the body of Messiah are not going to be resolved by Carlos del Toro in 2 Bible studies. It's just not going to happen, okay? But I'm going to do my best to give you a good understanding and my inclination of what I believe with regard to the role of women. And I'll just take away it could happen. Only a wife could say that. Thank you, though. See, now you threw me. Now you distracted me. Okay. But I will say this to take away the suspense, right? I believe that women have a much greater role in the body of Messiah than traditionally they have been given, okay? And I believe that the scriptures bear that out. I think that we have to be careful how we define that role. But I think that the way that that Christianity in general has viewed the role of women, I think that in many ways it has been an injustice. And I'm not prepared to say, and like I said, I'm just giving you a broad overview, and I'll come back to specifics as we go on. I'm not prepared to say that women should be in the role of what Christians would call pulpit ministry. The term pulpit ministry being in positions of eldership, for example, preaching and teaching in eldership, but neither do I believe that. So I'm not prepared to go that far, at least not yet, unless someone shows me something more. But I am prepared to say that women would have a much more visible role than they have now. And, obviously within Christianity, right, you have the full gamut. You have some churches that they don't let women speak at all. And then you have some churches that will ordain women left and right? And then everything in between along the spectrum, okay? And within groups that the folks that here have been more involved in within what would be loosely called sacred name movement and messianic movements, etc., it's a little bit more on the conservative side where women have a more limited role, okay? But but even with that, it depends on where you look. And some of that is changing, and some of it for the better, some of it not so much. So we have to be careful not to go to any extremes, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. So let's go to Genesis 1 in the JPS Torah commentary. And I'm just going to touch upon some of these passages. So, and some of this gets a little bit technical. Don't mind that. I'll point out what I think are the more important things here. So let's go to this concept of Adam and the image, okay? So he says Hebrew Adam is a generic term, and this is so important, is a generic term for humankind. It never appears in Hebrew in the feminine or plural. Isn't that interesting? He in the Hebrew language, as in a number of languages, but especially the Semitic languages, every word is assigned a masculine or feminine. But isn't it quite interesting that the word Adam is a generic term for humankind? It never appears in Hebrew in the feminine or the plural. in the in the feminine or plural, but it's still a generic term. Isn't that wild? So it's a masculine word, but it still is a generic term for humankind. It's almost as if it's almost, and it doesn't appear in it never appears in Hebrew in the feminine or the plural. So that's significant to me, right? Because even though it's not, so it's a masculine word, it doesn't appear in the feminine and it doesn't appear in the plural, yet every commentator and the context of the text views that word Adam as being a masculine term. But the interesting thing about it is that as a generic term for humankind, it's a generic, even though it's a masculine word, it's a generic term for humankind, meaning for me that it's not meant to be a plural thing because they become one. You understand? That's my point. They become one and they become enmeshed together. So it's one entity, that's Adam, that in effect is really neither masculine nor feminine. It's not, and it's not plural because they become one. So if you keep reading there, in this is Genesis 120 here. What is this here? 27, I guess. Yeah, 127. Okay, and then when you're in chapter 2 and you go into more detail, it says, hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife so that they become one flesh, right? So we'll come back to that. So somehow it's like she's absorbed together with him and they become one. So it's generic. In the first 5 chapters of Genesis, it is only rarely a proper name, Adam, with a capital A. The term encompasses both man and woman, as shown in verses 27 to 28, and here, let's go here, 5:1-2, where it is construed with plural verbs and terminations. It's interesting. So now in 5, it's construed with plural verbs. So it's a singular word that doesn't appear in the plural, and yet they employ plural words. Why? Because there's 2 elements operating within the same thing. So let's go there to Genesis 5. And this is why it's wonderful to look at the original languages, because you don't get that sense from the English terms. So in Genesis 5, verse 1, it says, this is the list of the descendants of Adam. When Elohim created humankind, and the word is Adam, when Elohim created humankind, he made them, plural. He made them in the likeness of Elohim. Male and female, he created them. There it is again. And he blessed them and named them humankind, named them Adam, when they were created. Very interesting. Okay, so let's go back to Genesis 1. In our image, after our likeness. This unique combination of expressions, virtually identical in meaning, emphasizes the incomparable nature of human beings and their special relationship to Yahweh. The full import of these terms can be grasped only within the broader context of biblical literature and against the background of ancient Near Eastern analogs. Okay, so I'm going to skip a lot of stuff here that, I don't think is as relevant to my discussion today, and go down to here. Without doubt, the terminology employed in Genesis 2:26 is derived from regal, that means royal vocabulary, which serves to elevate the king above the ordinary run of men. In the Bible, this idea has become democratized. In other words, for everybody, not just the king. All human beings are created in the image of Elohim. Each person bears the stamp of royalty. Each person bears the stamp of royalty, male and female. That's you. That's me. This was patently understood by the author of Psalm 8, cited above, which is Psalm 8. Oh, Yahweh, our Yahweh, how majestic is your name in all the earth. What is man that you think of him, and the son of man, right? His description of man in royal terms is his interpretation of the concept of the image of Elohim introduced in verse 26. Okay, down to the comment, they shall rule, right? They shall rule. The verbs used here and in verse 28 express the coercive power of the monarch, consonant with the explanation just given for the image of Elohim. This power, however, cannot include the license to exploit nature banefully for the following reasons. The human race is not inherently sovereign, but enjoys its dominion solely by the grace of Elohim. So it's talking about how Yahweh is co-regent with Yahweh. And the only reason that he has that authority is because the fact that Yahweh invested him with that authority. Okay. Then verse 27, male and female, he created them. No such sexual differentiation is noted in regard to animals. Human sexuality is of a wholly different order from that of the beast. The next verse shows it to be a blessed gift of Elohim woven into the fabric of life. As such, it cannot of itself be other than wholesome. By the same token, its abuse is treated in the Bible with particular severity. Its proper regulation is subsumed under the category of the holy, whereas sexual perversion is viewed with abhorrence as an affront to human dignity and a desecration of the eternal image in man. This is why sexual sin is so strongly frowned upon in the scriptures, because of this special, unique nature of male and female. Male and female, mankind, humankind is created in the image of Elohim. They are the image bearers of Yahweh. So anything that desecrates them is considered an affront to Elohim. That's why idolatry is so heinous, right? Continuing here. The definition of the human community contained in this verse is solemnly repeated in 5:1-2. That's what we just read about Adam. An indication of its seminal importance. It means it's foundational, right? It's foundational to everything else that you see in scripture. Both sexes are created on the sixth day by the hand of the one Elohim. That's the image, right? Both are made in his image on a level of absolute equality before him. Thus, the concept of humanity needs both male and female for its proper articulation. I love that. Thus, the concept of humanity, the human race, needs both male and female for its proper articulation. Means the human race is not the human race without both male and female. One is not superior to the other. It is noteworthy that the recurrent formula of every kind hitherto encountered with the emergence of every living thing is here omitted. There is only one human species. The notion of all humankind deriving from one common ancestry directly leads to the recognition of the unity of the human race, notwithstanding the infinite diversity of human culture. The sages of the Mishnah, that's the Jewish commentaries, in Sanhedrin 4:5 observed that mankind was created as a single unit in order to inculcate the idea that the destruction of a single life is tantamount to the destruction of the entire world. And conversely, the preservation of a single life is the preservation of the entire world. The sages further understood that Elohim, in order to promote social harmony, intended that no person have claim to unique ancestry as a pretext for asserting superiority over others. In other words, all human beings are the same. Okay, so let me skip a lot of this here, and let me go to chapter 2 and point out another couple of things. Okay. A fitting helper, Ezer Kenegdo, right? Let me go up a little bit. It is not good. This is on 218. The emphatic negative, it is not good, contrasts with the verdict of 131 that everything was very good, right? Because everything he saw, seen all his creation, and it was very good. And now he comes to something that's not good, right? This after the creation of male and female. The idea here is that man is recognized to be a social being. Celibacy is undesirable. Genesis Rabbah 17:2, more commentary, expresses this point as follows. Whoever has, okay, forget about that. I don't think that's relevant here, because people can be unmarried and still be okay. So there's no, celibacy is not presented as a sin, is just presented as not the ideal situation. Okay. He says a fitting helper, literally a helper corresponding to him. This term cannot be the meaning because Hebrew Ezer, employed here to describe the intended role of the woman, is often the use of Elohim in his relation to man. Very interesting. Same language is used of Yahweh's relationship to man, Elohim's relationship to man, as woman's relationship to man, which is incredibly special. Okay. Anything else I want to bring out here? Okay, so talking about Eve being created out of his ribs, one of his ribs. This is interesting. The mystery of the intimacy between husband and wife and the indispensable role that the woman ideally plays in the life of man are symbolically described in terms of her creation out of his body. The rib taken from man's side thus connotes physical union and signifies that she is his companion and partner ever at his side. In other words, they're inseparable. She's created, she comes straight out of him, flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. In other words, it's such a different concept from the way that the social constructs that we have in our society, where you can get married and whenever you just don't feel like it, you just emotionally don't feel like you want to deal with it anymore, you just dissolve the marriage. See, that's not how this works. That's not how this works. So let's continue reading. This correspondence between the part of the body and the role of the one identified with it is found in both Mesopotamian and Greek literature. Okay, and then he goes and describes some similar types of things in ancient Near Eastern things, which you don't need to look at right now. Okay. Shall be called woman. Insofar as the power of naming implies authority, the text voices the social reality of the ancient Near East. Yet the terminology used here differs from that employed in verse 20 for naming the animals. Here, the man gives her a generic, not a personal name, and that designation is understood to be derived from his own, which means he acknowledges woman to be his equal. Moreover, in naming her Isha, he simultaneously names himself. Hitherto, he is consistently called Adam. He now calls himself Ish for the first time. Thus, he discovers his own manhood and fulfillment only when he faces the woman, the human being who is to be his partner in life. That blows my mind. I'm going to read that again. Here, the man gives her a generic, not a personal name, and that designation is understood to be derived from his own, which means he acknowledges woman to be his equal. Moreover, in naming her Isha, he simultaneously names himself. Hitherto, unto this point, he is consistently called Adam. He now calls himself Ish for the first time. So this is Isha because she comes from me, Ish. Thus he discovers his own manhood. Thus he discovers his own manhood and fulfillment only when he faces the woman, the human being who is to be his partner in life. Very interesting. And then last thing I'll read here, and then we'll move on to some other things, is the idea of clinging and one flesh. There's a seeming contradiction here, since Hebrew davak, which is the word that's used here for cling, the Hebrew word davak, to cling, essentially expresses the idea, and this is fascinating too, essentially expresses the idea of two distinct entities becoming attached to one another while preserving their separate identities. Isn't that fascinating? That's what the word davak, remember this guy's an expert, right? The word davak in Hebrew, the nuance, this is why you miss these things in English, right? Davak, it means to cling, and the implication, it essentially expresses the idea of two distinct entities becoming attached to one another, while preserving, in other words, at the same time, preserving their separate identities. So it's not that the woman comes together with the man and somehow she gets absorbed and she has to do everything. She becomes a little carbon copy of him, right? The little woman, right? Can't stand that nonsense. There's no such thing. The woman goes into a relationship with the man and they come together. She maintains her identity as a woman. He maintains his identity as a man. And I don't just mean in terms of the characteristics of a woman and characteristics of a man, although I believe that that's true as well. And you see that when you talk about the hierarchies in, for example, 1 Corinthians 11, where we're talking about the head covering for a woman. And the implication there is that whether a man is engaged in public worship or a woman is engaged in public worship, even in a leadership type position, right? With the distinctions that I described earlier before, when they're doing that, a woman should look like a woman and a man should look like a man. And there should not be a blurring of the distinction between the two because they are two separate entities, right? So again, we'll cover that another time. But the main thing here is that they come to this relationship They come together as one in unity, in purpose, in complementing one another to be of one mind, so to speak, in this relationship, but yet they maintain their separate identities. To become one flesh refers to the physical aspects of marriage, as though the separated elements seek one another for reunification. So when you think about two nations who have been divided, right? You think about East and West Berlin, during the height of the Cold War. And you think about that ridiculous wall separating between the two of them. And when that wall came down, the level of celebration for that country to be reunified, right? This is a similar concept here. So this concept of this coming together is like, it's like as if both pieces are looking at one another saying, where have you been all my life, right? The underlying meaning of the paradox is clear. If it is noted that the verb davak is often used to describe human urine, the underlying meaning of the paradox is clear. In other words, the paradox meaning, how could this be that you have two entities, but that they become attached to one another, but they still preserve their separate identities? How can that be? The underlying meaning of that paradox is clear. If it is noted, you understand that. If you note that the verb davak is often used to describe human yearning for and devotion to Elohim. Sexual relations between husband and wife do not rise above the level of animality, above the level of animals, unless they be informed by and imbued with spiritual, emotional, and mental affinity. That's what a true marriage is supposed to be about a unification of spiritual, emotional, and mental, all aspects, fulfilling one another in every aspect, right? Okay, so there's much more that I could say about this, but that's good enough for now. So let's go back and just expand this a little bit, right? So, so this relationship between men and women, okay, I think it's pretty clear how you can look at Galatians 3:28 and see the Old Testament foundations of the equality between men and women. Now, let's just go to a complete shift and talk a little bit about how women are described in the scriptures, because ultimately we want to bring this into the practical sense, right? So this is all wonderful foundationally and philosophically, etc. But how does this manifest in the scriptures with women in different things in the scriptures? So let's look at women leadership in the Bible, right? So there will be people that the only example they'll ever come up with regard to women leadership is Deborah, right? How many times have you heard that? Yeah, someone wants to get points, particularly the males. Let's be honest, right? And they say, "Oh yeah, Deborah," right? Because they want to get a pat on the back for recognizing there was at least one woman that had some kind of leadership in the scriptures, right? But notice how they always want to qualify that. You know what I mean? When I say qualify something, you can't just leave it alone and let it stand as is. You got to qualify that. You got to say something like, well, the only reason Deborah did that was because there were no men who were willing to take over, who were willing to take leadership, right? As if women don't have the capacity unless they're doing it for that particular purpose. Well, there are no men, so the women got to do it, right? That's very condescending. I'm sorry. I've never bought that. I think it's ridiculous. So she did it because she was a leader, right? The particular reasons why don't matter. That men were wimpy in her time, okay, granted, but it has nothing to do with her capacity for leadership. But let's not even go to Deborah, right? Why is Deborah the only one that we ever go to, right? And by mentioning this list here of people, I'm not trying to score points with you either, right? That's not what this is about for me. I want to point out things in the scriptures that are not normally pointed out or not normally seen in that way. So if you go to Exodus 15, and I'm just scratching the surface, right? These are only a few examples. So Exodus 15, who is it talking about? Just give me a second here. Down in verse 20. This version that I have, bear with me because I just got this yesterday and I'm not used to it. And it's very difficult to find verses with this one, the way they have the things laid out. But anyway, that's my issue. Verse 20. Then the prophet Miriam, the what? The what? The prophet Miriam. Long before there was a Deborah, there was a Miriam. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. Oh, but Miriam, spoke against Moses, and she got leprosy, and blah blah blah. Yeah. And Moses struck the rock, and he also got punished, right? And on and and Aaron created the golden calf after everyone threw their right. So let's not look at all the negative stuff. Then the prophet Miriam, because there's enough blame to go around. Aaron's sister took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." And then they continue there. Okay. So the song, this is referred to as the Song of Miriam, and Miriam is referred to as a prophet. Now, you want to see a corresponding verse to that? Let's go over to Micah, the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 4. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. I'm sorry, what does that say? For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses and Aaron, right? I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Miriam is listed in the same breath as Moses and Aaron. Is that because they were brothers and sister? I don't think so. The context of this, he redeemed them from slavery. The Exodus motif is prominent throughout the scriptures. And in this verse, through a prophet of Yahweh, Yahweh himself speaking through the prophet, he says, he acknowledges that in the leadership before them was Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Miriam was leader. Okay. The book of Judges, the one that we all know, Judges 4. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh after Ehud died. So Yahweh sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoim. Then the Israelites cried out to Yahweh for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, so here we see another one described again as a prophetess. And that word prophetess, right? It implies leadership. It doesn't imply, and that's the thing. That's another notion that some of us have been raised with a certain idea of what a prophet is, and we tend to think that a prophet is someone who's almost like a glorified fortune teller. Prophets are not fortune tellers. Okay, the main point of a prophet, male or female, was not to tell the future. Right. The fact that Yahweh gives them a knowledge of the end from the beginning on many occasions is incidental to the job. That's not the job of a prophet. The job of a prophet or a seer is to proclaim the word of Yahweh and to lead. They were leaders. They were ones who proclaimed the Torah. They were the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. That's of a different caliber. Those folks were in effect the guardians of the Torah, right? They were the guardians of the Torah, and they were the ones who would correct, keep people on the straight and narrow with regard to their with regard to the observance of the Torah, to keep them out of trouble, right, and to help them to get out of trouble if they got themselves into trouble. But the prophets, in the sense of Moses, Miriam, Aaron, these were people who were put in leadership of the people. They came to them for rulings. It's exactly at the gate, right? So at that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. That's a position of judgment. She would judge cases. And the Israelites came up to her for judgment. Okay. And then it goes on and it describes all the exploits of Deborah, right? So So yeah, so that's a very prominent example and the one that people will typically go to. Now, I want to also point out that not every example of a woman in scripture who exercised authority it was not necessarily always legitimate authority, right? But the fact that there were women leaders, be it legitimate or illegitimate, is a fact, right? So if you go to 2 Kings chapter 8, you see an example of that in terms of an illegitimate ruler, but one yet who was recognized by the men. So I don't want that to be lost on you either, that just because someone would exercise improper judgment doesn't mean that they weren't recognized for being leaders. And this version is driving me up the wall. So just bear with me, okay? I've never seen a version of scripture that has the book names of the books at the bottom and in small letters that these older eyes can't quite take. Okay, hold on. A little too much information. All right. 2 Kings 8, beginning with verse 16. Okay. In the 5th year of King Joram, son of Ahab of Israel, Jehoram, son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, began to reign. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 8 years in Jerusalem. Am I in the right place? All right, just be with me for a minute here. Bear with me. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to go through this whole story, but if you want to put in your notes 2 Kings 8:16 to 11:16, that's a whole passage that you can read. But note in chapter 8, verse 26, Ahaziah was 22 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of King Omri of Israel. He also walked in the way of the house of Ahab, doing what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was son-in-law to the house of Ahab. And then it goes on telling more of the story here. And then chapter 11. Now, when Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she set about to destroy all the royal family. But Yehosheba, King Joram's daughter, Ahaziah's sister, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's children who were about to be killed. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus she hid him from Athaliah so that he was not killed. He remained with her for 6 years, hid in the house of Yahweh, while Athaliah reigned over the land. So she was recognized as a queen. So there was a queen in Israel. Now she was, in the big picture, an illegitimate one, but she was a queen nevertheless. Okay. I'm not going to go to verses for this, but I just want to point out several of the women who were women of excellent repute, who were recognized as women of high standing. Sarah, Abraham's wife, she was the mother of Isaac, right? So she was a progenitor. She was not a progenitor, but she was the one who gave birth to Isaac, and eventually, that led to everybody else, right? Hannah, who was the mother of Samuel in 1 Samuel. Hannah was a prominent woman. Bathsheba, who was David's queen. We tend to think about Bathsheba only in terms of the incident of adultery that David committed with Bathsheba, but Bathsheba eventually became his wife, and she, by all indications, was a wise woman. Matter of fact, some people think that over in Proverbs, when there's a mother speaking to her son Lemuel, some people think that Lemuel is just another term for Solomon. Don't know if that's accurate, but that's what many scholars believe. And in that case, who was the one teaching Lemuel? She said, I taught you this, I taught you that, right? Don't forget this that I taught you, etc. Well, who was his mother? It's Bathsheba. We forget that Bathsheba was Solomon. We think so much of Bathsheba in the adultery episode that we forget that Bathsheba was the one who raised Solomon. It's her son, right? So the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4, and this is the woman that was Elisha dealt with, right? Abigail, who was a worthy woman that David was about to destroy her husband, Naboth, not Naboth, Nabal, and all of his army, and Abigail stopped him. And when Nabal died, David came and she became his wife. Ruth, of course, who was the grandmother of David, that she became, she was considered to be a worthy woman. Queen Esther, right? I mean, when you start looking at this, we got to stop looking, men. We got to stop pointing to Deborah, right? Because you're shooting yourself in the foot. I'm sorry. Okay. What about 2 Kings 22? And I'm not saying any men here are doing that, right? I'm just saying men in general. So please don't misunderstand me. Second Kings 22, verse 20. And once again, am I in the right place? Oh, okay, I see. I got to back up just a little bit. So in the days of King Josiah, in his 18th year, when he was 18 years old, in the 18th year, I guess technically 19th, but he was 19 years old. In the 18th, 18. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary, to the house of Yahweh. And long story short, they found the book of the law. They found what scholars believe was the book of Deuteronomy in the wreckage. The wreckage is not the right word, but in the rubble, in the refuse. And they, when in verse 11, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Akbor, son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and the king's servant Asaiah, saying, "Go inquire of Yahweh for me, for the people, and for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that have been found. For great is the wrath of Yahweh that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the word of this book, the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us." So, picture this: they didn't know this book existed, the book of Deuteronomy. The king tears his clothes, which is a sign of mourning, because he recognizes what a momentous event this is. This is huge. For the king to tear his clothes, this is a sign of mourning. The king is not happy. Why is he not happy? Because they've been disobeying Yahweh for years and years, because out of ignorance, right? This is a huge deal, the finding of this book, right? Because he had a heart to serve Almighty Yahweh. So he says, we need to pick up the pace and serve Yahweh, learn how to do, what we've been doing wrong. We need to figure out how to do those things and how to do them right, because, the implication is the nation, the well-being of the nation depends on it. So who did he go to? And by the way, Isaiah was a contemporary here, right? But who did they go to? So the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam, Akbor, Shaphan, verse 14, and Asaiah went to who? To the prophetess Huldah, the wife of Shallum, son of Tikva, son of Harkas, keeper of the wardrobe. She resided in, that's going to be an interesting position, keeper of the wardrobe. That's a story for another day. She resided in Jerusalem in the second quarter, where they consulted her. She declared to them, "Thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, the king. Thus says Yahweh, I will indeed bring disaster on this place and on its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read." And then she goes on and, verse 19, because your heart was penitent and you humbled yourself before Yahweh, when you heard how I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and because you have torn your clothes and went before me, I have also heard you, says Yahweh. Therefore, I will gather you to your ancestors, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. Your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring on this place. They took the message back to the king. This is a prophetess. This is a woman in a leadership position that affects the entire nation. Yeah, and this version is a more archaic version. So in the Revised Standard Version, this is the official version of the Church of England, I think. So the language that it preserves is a little bit more archaic in nature. So it may not say, in your version, it may not say prophetess. It may in fact say prophet, right? which is the same thing. It's just, the usage of language and the gender issues, etc. Okay. So these are all examples of women of repute, women in leadership positions, right? What about in the New Testament? Well, let's just shift over there at about 15 minutes. I want to give you a little bit more here. So let me look up one thing here very quickly because I forgot to look it up. Remember, what I'm doing is I'm building a case for how the role of women has been underutilized. One of the things that you've noticed that I've been doing in recent months is asking women to pray and trying to, be a little bit more inclusive in how things are done, because I think that, and it has surprised a few of you, and I want to make sure that you understand the reasons why I'm doing that, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this study, because we're in a time, and it's not to just be nice, right? In my sense, that would be very condescending of me. We're in a time in history where things are happening, and it's all hands on deck, right? It's all hands on deck. So let me just find this here. Okay, the book of Luke 2. Beginning with verse 36. There was also a prophetess called Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age, having been widowed after a 7-year marriage, and was now 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped with fasting and prayer night and day. She came up at that moment and gave thanks to Elohim and spoke about Yahshua to everyone who was waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. That is a loaded statement there, but I got to keep going. So when they had finished everything according to the law of Yahweh, they returned to Galilee. This is when they presented Yahshua on the 8th day. So when they had finished everything according to the law of Yahweh, they returned to Galilee, to their town of Nazareth. The child grew and became strong and was full of wisdom, and Yahweh's grace was upon him. So the fact that in the midst of this dedication of Yahshua on the 8th day, the fact that one that's described here is a female prophet is significant, right? It's a significant thing. You want to know what else is significant that we take for granted? Well, let's take a look at a couple of things here. So let's stay in the New Testament, and let's look at John 20. On the first day of the week, very early, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. For those of you who don't know why I say Miriam is the actual word that would have been used for her. Miriam Magdalene name came to the tomb while it was still dark. She saw that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. So she ran off and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one Yahshua loved, that's John. They've taken the master out of the tomb, she said. We don't know where they've put him. So Peter and the other disciple set off and went to the tomb. And then a little bit later in the chapter, verse 11, but Miriam stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she stooped down to look into the tomb. There she saw 2 angels clothed in white, one at the head and one at the feet of where Yahshua's body had been lying. Woman, they said to her, why are you crying? They've taken away my master, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. As she said this, she turned around and saw Yahshua standing there. She didn't know it was Yahshua. That's because of his glorified body. He looked different. Woman, Yahshua said to her, why are you crying? Who are you looking for? She guessed he must be the gardener. Okay, I'll resist. Sir, she said, if you've carried him off somewhere, tell me where you've put him and I will take him away. Miriam, said Yahshua. She turned and spoke in Hebrew. Rabboni, she said, which means teacher. Don't cling to me, said Yahshua. I haven't yet gone up to my father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I'm going up to my father and your father, to my Elohim and your Elohim. Miriam Magdalene went and told the disciples, I've seen the master, and that he said these things to her. Hold your place there and go to Matthew 28. Verse 1, dawn was breaking on the first day of the week. The Sabbath was over. Okay. Miriam Magdalene and the other Miriam had come to look at the tomb, when suddenly there was a great earthquake. An angel of Yahweh came down from heaven, etc., etc. Don't be afraid. Verse 5 said the angel to the women, I know you're looking for Yahshua who was crucified. He isn't here. He's been raised as he said he would be. Come and see the place where he was lying. And then go at once and tell his disciples that he's been raised from the dead and that he's going on ahead of you to Galilee. That's where you'll see him. There, I've told you. The women scurried off quickly from the tomb in a mixture of terror and great delight and went to tell his disciples. Suddenly there was Yahshua himself. He met them and said, greetings. They came up and to him and took hold of his feet, prostrating themselves in front of him. Don't be afraid, said Yahshua to them. Go and tell my brothers that they should go to Galilee. Tell them they'll see me there. Okay. And let's go one more to Luke 24, because you could see it in Mark 16 also, if you want to list Mark 16, but we don't have to look at it in every version here. But Luke 24. The women went to the tomb in the very early morning of the first day of the week, carrying the spices they had prepared, etc., etc., etc. Down in verse 5, but the men said to them, why look for the living with the dead? He isn't here. He's been raised. Don't you remember? While you were still in Galilee, he told you that the Son of Man must be handed over into the hands of sinners and be crucified again and rise on the third day. And they remembered his words. They went back away from the tomb and told all this to the 11 and all the others. It was Miriam Magdalene, Joanna, and Miriam, the mother of James, and the others with them. They said this to the apostles, and this message seemed to them just stupid, useless talk, and they didn't believe them. Of course, they didn't believe them. Peter, though, it's interesting how you have different versions, right? Like different accounts. Peter, though, got up and ran to the tomb. He stooped down and saw only the grave clothes. He went back home perplexed at what had happened. Well, it's what they said, right? So I'm glad I read the version in Luke because it shows the attitude of the men, right? So what's my point with all this? My point is that the most momentous event in human history, and I'm not being melodramatic, the most important event before or after to the present day that will ever occur in human history, which is the resurrection of the Messiah, the resurrection that began the new creation, which will culminate in the ultimate resurrection and humanity being saved, right? The most momentous event in human history was first reported by who? Was first witnessed by who? Women. Not just Miriam Magdalene, Miriam, who I assume was his mother, Joanna, and whoever else was there with him. And we take that for granted. We read that all the time. We, Christianity, Bible believers, right? We read that and we just, oh, that's nice, right? No. Don't gloss over that. We're talking about the ancient world, and let's not kid ourselves. Women in the ancient world did not have the same status as women in the modern world. They just didn't, right? They weren't the chattel that people want to make them out to be. I dispute that, right? And I've already pointed out certain things that show that that's not accurate because women were recognized in leadership positions, even in Israel, right? And in the Roman world and the Greek world, even more so. You see in the book of Acts, throughout the book of Acts, prominent women, and they're described as prominent women, right? So women didn't have the status of, just, meek little, that's not how it worked. But women had a certain role in society and they were not viewed in the same way. And the witness of women, like in a court of law, did not carry the same weight as the witness of a man. And history bears that out. And yet the witnesses present for the greatest event that occurred in human history were women. And they were the first ones to carry that message. That is not insignificant, and we need to keep that in mind. A couple more things. Acts 16. Paul in Philippi, which was the first assembly in excuse me, not Philippi. Yeah, Philippi. Okay. Which was in Macedonia, the first assembly in Europe, that was established in Europe. Verse 16, verse 11. So we sailed away from Troas and made a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day to Neapolis. From there, we went on to Philippi, a Roman colony that is the chief city of the district of Macedonia, the first assembly planted in Europe. We stayed in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to a place by a river where we reckoned there was a place of prayer, and there we sat down. Some women had gathered, and we spoke to them. There was a woman called Lydia, an Elohim-fearer, who was a seller of purple from Thyatira. Yahweh opened her heart to pay attention to what Paul was saying. She was baptized with all her household. If you will judge me faithful to Yahweh, she begged us, please come and stay at my home. So she persuaded us. As we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a girl who had a spirit of divination. She and her oracles made a good living for her owners. Okay, and it goes on from there. But my point here is that, again, the first assembly established in Europe, the very first one, was led by a woman. How did they do their services? There's no mention of men here necessarily. They may have been, but they're not mentioned here. So what did they do? Did they just, did they listen to tapes? Right? They didn't, right? They did things themselves. I don't mean to be facetious, but I think we overlook these things and we kind of, gloss by them. And Paul is interacting with these women, right? And many examples that I could go to, but not only Paul, right? Let's go to Luke chapter 10. See, what the believers were doing was revolutionary in many ways. That happened with slavery. If you remember, we did the study on Philemon. And in Philemon, Paul didn't flat out tell Philemon, hey, release Onesimus, free him. But basically he said, you know what? I know you're going to do the right thing. In essence, saying, if you claim to be a believer, you're going to do the right thing. And eventually you're going to see the right thing. I'm not going to tell you, but a word to the wise is sufficient. At some point, if you're going to say that you believe this message where there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, right? You're going to release this guy. And we know historically that he did, and Onesimus became a bishop in the course of time. Matter of fact, I believe, I'd have to go back and double check, but I believe that Onesimus became one of the bishops of Ephesus at some point, a former slave. So with regard to women, same thing. They were making inroads with regard to women that in that known element of the world, in that time of the world, it was revolutionary. The way that, and who did this? Believers, right? What people call Christians is what did this. Who did this? Luke chapter 10. Again, we overlook this and we just kind of, that's a nice story, and we move on. But we don't think of the deeper implications, in my opinion. Luke 10, verse 38. On their journey, Yahshua came into a village. There was a woman there named Martha who welcomed him. She had a sister named Miriam. Stop there. Don't continue reading. Who are Martha and Miriam? Well, we know from other passages that this was in, I want to say in Bethesda. I have to double check and make sure. Who were Martha and Miriam? They were sisters of Lazarus, right? Lazarus, who was eventually resurrected. Lazarus, you see in John 11, was resurrected, right? Martha and Miriam. She had a sister named Miriam who sat at the master's feet and listened to his teaching. Martha was frantic with all the work in the kitchen. Master, she said, coming into where they were, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work all by myself? Tell her to give me a hand. Martha, he replied, you are fretting and fussing about so many things. Only one thing matters. Miriam has chosen the best part, and it's not going to be taken away from her. And what was it that Miriam had chosen? To sit at the master's feet and listen to his teaching. Now tell me, who sat at a master's feet to listen to his teaching? A disciple. Disciples did that. This wasn't a church service. This wasn't a Sabbath day where he was gathering people. This was people listening to his teachings. Disciples sat at the feet of their masters, which means by implication that Miriam and probably Martha, when she got her head straight, were considered to be disciples of Yahshua the Messiah. Don't overlook that. Right? A disciple. And what is a disciple discipled for? You tell me. Just to learn and to go about life and enjoy life? What was the point of discipleship? to go on and disciple others, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, we don't want to take a leap and say, okay, well, now she became an elder somewhere or whatever. We're not saying that, right? But a disciple wasn't discipled just for the sake of, oh, this is a nice academic exercise. By its nature, it was like an apprenticeship, right? They were all the disciples that were receiving teaching, they're called Talmidim. They are, the purpose of getting discipled is so that you become like your master, so that you in turn can go, it's like a mentor, right? Then you can go and mentor others. Now, some people might say, well, maybe they're going to just be mentoring women. Maybe that's true, but we don't know, right? We really don't know. We don't know who she wound up discipling. Could have been men. It could have been women only. It could have been women and men. We don't know. All I know is that there's a woman sitting among a group of men listening to Yahshua teach and learning how to disciple. But if we don't want to go and take the leap, right? Well, then let's go over to Romans 16, and we'll end with Romans 16. So I'm leaving all the juicy verses till next week, right? That gives me a week to prepare a little bit more. Romans 16, I'll leave you with this. Beginning with verse 1. Let me introduce you, Paul. And by the way, Romans is considered one of the most important letters of Paul because it outlines major doctrinal issues. Let me introduce to you our sister Phoebe. She is a deacon. A what? She is a deacon in the assembly at Cenchrea. Oh, deacon. Yeah, that's because she was married to a deacon, and because by virtue of being married to a deacon, then she could be called a deacon by association. Show me the verse. Show me the verse. I can't tell you how many times I hear that, and I have to ask, show me the verse where it says that she was married to a deacon. She is a deacon in the assembly at Cenchrea. I want you to welcome her. And by the way, the deacons were not necessarily the preachers, right? But we do see that deacons did preach, right? Philip with the eunuch, and Stephen was a deacon, right? And anyway, you get my point. So I don't know. There's no record of female preaching, which is why I say I'm not prepared to go and take a leap and say, okay, well, females can preach. There's no record of females preaching, but there is a record of them doing something. And what is that? Well, we'll get to that. She is a deacon in the assembly at Cenchrea. I want you to welcome her in Yahweh as is proper for one of Yahweh's people. It's already 5 o'clock. Please give me about 10 more minutes if you don't mind. I want you to welcome her in Yahweh as is proper for one of Yahweh's people. Please give her whatever practical assistance she may need from you. She has been a benefactor to many people, myself included. She was useful for Paul's work. Greet Prisca and Aquila. Who's Prisca? Prisca is short for Priscilla. Where do you see Priscilla? You see her in the book of Acts. She is wife to Aquila. My fellow workers in King Yahshua. My fellow workers. Priscilla is recognized as the fellow worker. They put their lives on the line for me. It isn't only me, but to all the Gentile assemblies that owe them a debt of gratitude. Greet the assembly in their house as well. Greet the what? The assembly in their house as well. So they had a home fellowship. They had a home assembly, which was led by them, Priscilla and Aquila. I will hold my place there and go over to Acts 18, where we're introduced to Priscilla and Aquila. Acts 18:18. Paul stayed on for several more days with the believers and then said his farewells and sailed away to Syria, taking Priscilla and Aquila with him. In Cenchrea, which is where Phoebe was from, he had his hair cut off since he was under a vow. And then, they said their farewells. Paul had to move on. He left Ephesus, went to Caesarea, etc. And then down in verse 24, now there arrived in Ephesus a Jew named Apollos who came from Alexandria. He was an eloquent man and powerful when it came to expounding scripture. He had received instruction in the way of Yahweh. He was an eager speaker and taught the things about Yahshua accurately, even though he only knew the baptism of John. So he had something that was not quite all there. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him to one side and expounded the way of Yahweh to him more accurately. So his doctrine was not completely sound. So they took him aside. But who took him aside? Aquila? Priscilla and Aquila, right? They took him to one side and expounded the way of Yahweh to him more accurately. you form your own conclusions with that. Back to Romans 16. Greet my dear, I'm in verse 5. Greet my dear Epaenetus. He was the first fruits of the Messiah's harvest in Asia. Greet Miriam, who has worked hard for you, a woman. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives and fellow prisoners, who are well known among the apostles and who were in the Messiah before I was. And we could go on from there, but that's the main part of it. But this is very curious. Greet Andronicus and Junia. Now, there are some people who want to say, Junia, well, that's probably a man. No. There's no record of a man with a name like Junia. That's a female name. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, so apparently they were related to Paul, and fellow prisoners. Does he mean that literally? And if he means that literally, why was she in prison? Was she preaching the word as well? And even more importantly, who are well known among the apostles and who were in the Messiah before I was. Now it's interesting, who are well known among the apostles. There are some commentators that say, the way that they translate that Greek there, that it is possible that she may have actually been considered an apostle. Now, I don't particularly agree with that. I think the evidence is probably flimsy for that, or it would be translated that way. I've not seen any versions that actually say that. But it's interesting that there's even a slight of a hint of doubt about that. And by the way, not apostles in the sense of Mark and Thaddeus and Peter and John and all those people. That was a special apostleship, right? But James was called an apostle. Barnabas was called an apostle, right? Because they were sent, they were emissaries, right? And that's a study for another day. So, but it doesn't matter. She was well known. So let's assume for the moment, which I believe that she was not actually an apostle, but she was well known among the apostles and a fellow prisoner of Paul. That means that she was engaged in active service, active work. And who knows what that entailed. So you see all these things and you have to ask yourself, what is going on here? Is this all these women here in Rome, in the Roman assembly, right? Or not necessarily in the Roman assembly, but who were associated with the Roman assembly, because Phoebe was from Cenchrea, right? So you can't ignore those things or lightly gloss over them. And the last thing, I said that Romans would be the last thing, but 1 Corinthians 11, and we'll probably start here next week. I just want to read you, when I said that they're not necessarily preachers, right? But you look at something like 1 Corinthians 11, and again, something that we're so intent on looking at the doctrine of headship and of head coverings when you go to 1 Corinthians 11, that you just kind of lightly gloss over what it's saying. It says, I can imitate me, just as I'm copying the Messiah. I congratulate you that you are remembering me in everything and that you are keeping the traditions as I hand them on to you. But I want you to know this, that the Messiah is the head of every man and the husband is the head of every wife. That's that order that I'm describing to you, that systematic order. And the husband is the head of every wife, and Elohim is the head of the Messiah. That's not a declaration of value. That's a declaration of order, of service, so that chaos doesn't ensue in the family, in the public worship. We're not going to apologize for an order being established by Almighty Yahweh to get things done decently and in order. It's only this culture that takes those things and all of a sudden turns it into issues of worth and issues of importance and superiority. We've already seen that women and men are not unequal to one another. They are equal to one another. But in terms of the work that is being done in these different institutions in life, there is an order that's established. Let me ask you, who would ever in their right mind, just think, let's not even take it very far. In your own workplace, do you not have managers? Do you not have supervisors and subordinates? Think about your supervisor for a moment, okay? And, I really want you to think about this. Think about your supervisor. Think about your boss, right? Is your boss a better person than you? Is your boss superior to you? Would you say that about your boss? Really, would you consider your boss? Would you go to somebody else and say, you know what, my boss is a better quality human being than me or more important than I am? I wouldn't. Matter of fact, I thought the opposite for some of my bosses. That's just my own ego, right? But I'm keeping it light, but I'm trying to make an important point here. You wouldn't in your wildest dreams equate the value of your personhood with the value of someone who has a positional importance over you in terms of the order of your thing, right? But that's exactly what we do when it comes to men and women. We say, okay, so the man has been given the headship over the woman. He's been given the position, and I won't even say boss, because in this culture, that's cause to take off your head, right? To be given the position of leadership over his wife, immediately that's translated as, oh, you're saying that the man is better than the woman. Where have I said that? Where has the scripture said that? We know the scriptures from the very beginning, from Genesis itself, does emphatically not say that. And yet in our culture, somehow we've been duped through gender politics to believe that one thing equates to the other, and it simply does not. It just gives an order so that everything can be done decently, because someone has to be able to make those types of decisions. And let me tell you, I've been in leadership positions in my jobs. I've been a manager, I've been a supervisor, and I can promise you that I've never felt any inherent sense of superiority over anyone else. On the contrary, I had to recognize and be humble enough to understand when people knew more than I did, because the work was done by them. Through my leadership, my unique skills was to put it all together, but some of their technical skills were head and shoulder above mine. So I'm not saying that to hold myself up as some paragon of leadership. I'm saying that to say you got to understand the role of leadership, the role of hierarchy, or as the scriptures refers to it, headship, right? The concept of headship, you need to understand that in the context of what it's trying to convey, which is in a concept of an order, which has nothing to do with inherent value or worth, right? So that wasn't even the point I came here to make, but I thought, yeah, I'll probably repeat that next week in some form, Yahweh willing. But here's what I wanted to make. Verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies, there's that word prophesying again. So what is that? Foretelling the future? No. The word prophesying means to exhort. You see this all throughout the book of Corinthians, the letter of Corinthians. The word prophesy is essentially for when it's done in the context of men, it usually refers to preaching. 1 Corinthians, go over to, hold your place in 1 Corinthians 11 and go over to 1 Corinthians 14, which is talking about the order in the service, right? So in verse 14, it says, down in verse 29, as for prophets, is that word. As for prophets, let 2 or 3 speak and the others evaluate what is said. What does that mean? That they're all prophesying at the same time? No. It says, let 2 or 3 speak as we typically do. A person gives a short message and then another one gives a short message, right? And, so you see, for example, elders get together and they're given 5 minutes each to speak. This is what we're talking about, right? Or someone gives a short message and someone gives another perspective, another message, right? That's what it's talking about. If fresh revelation comes to someone sitting there, the first person should be silent. If Elder Mike and I are in a service, Elder Mike's not going to get up there and start saying things and say, no, that's not what we should be saying, Mike. That would be rude and that would be disorderly in the service. So this is saying when Elder Mike is speaking, Carlos shuts up. Doesn't mean that Carlos is inferior to Mike or that Mike's inferior to Carlos. It means that when it's his turn to speak, it's his turn to speak. And when it's Carlos's turn to speak, then it's Carlos's turn to speak. And then Mike is silent, right? Because that's how it works. That's how orderly things are done. If fresh revelation comes to someone sitting there, the first person should be silent. So I think of a great idea, and then I don't interrupt Mike to say, hey, Mike, don't forget this, Mike. No, I wait my turn, and then I make my point. You can all prophesy one by one so that everyone can learn and everyone can be encouraged. The spirits of prophets are under the control of prophets, since Yahweh is Elohim, not of chaos, but of peace. And that's how you maintain order and service. So return now to 1 Corinthians 11, which is just 3 chapters before. Every man, verse 4, who prays or prophesies while wearing something on his head brings shame on his head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered brings shame on her head. So that's not the main topic here, but there are activities that are occurring here. The main topic is, how she appears with an uncovered head as compared to with a covered head, right? In other words, women need to look like women and men need to look like men. But what is she doing? She's also praying or prophesying. What exactly does that mean? I don't know. But I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that she shut up in the assembly, right? So when you go over to, 1 Corinthians 14, the same chapter that we were just in, and it says something like, in verse, okay, let me see here. Continuing to read where I was, as a matter of fact, as in all the assemblies, verse 33, as in all the assemblies of Yahweh's people, the women should keep silence in the assemblies. They are not permitted to speak. They should remain in submission, just as the law declares. If they want to understand something more, they should ask their own husbands when they get home. It's shameful, you see, for a woman to speak in the assembly. And then it goes on speaking from there. Whoa, those are fighting words, right? Well, if you take them out of context, yeah. But does it mean that a woman doesn't speak at all in the assembly? It can't mean that. Why can't it mean that? Because we just saw 3 chapters before that she prays or prophesies in the assembly. How can it possibly mean that she shuts her mouth in the assembly and never utters a word? Because, you got to be quiet and just go to your husband at home. Sorry, that doesn't make any sense to me. And the scripture does not contradict itself. So that's got to mean something different. Will we ever fully know what that means? Probably not, because we don't have access to the exact things that Paul was trying to, communicate with and respond to during his time. But we know it can't mean that. So we have more to talk about, right? Because we have, in addition to this gem, we have 1 Timothy 2, 8-15, and we have Titus 2, 3-5, and 1 Peter 3, 1-6, which some of you were probably thinking that I was going to go ahead and answer today. Thankfully, I have a reprieve because of time. But seriously speaking, I hope that this has helped to lay a foundation and that it's helped to give you some perspective on some insights on some things that you may not have thought about before, so that you can let that percolate for the next few days, and then Yahweh willing will build upon that foundation next week, and we'll take it from there. Okay. All right. So at this time,